In the heart of the snow-covered wilderness, a man is mocked for digging a trench around his Quonset hut. His neighbors laugh, thinking it's an absurd and unnecessary effort. But when the winter storms rage and the snow piles high, they will learn that his stubbornness was the key to keeping his home dry, safe, and standing against the harshest elements the wilderness can throw at him. Before we dive into this tale of survival, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will reveal an even greater test of human ingenuity against nature's fury. The snow had already begun to fall in early October, thin flakes that drifted lazily through the air like whispers from the sky. The harsh northern winds were not far behind, and they would soon turn the landscape into a brutal winter wonderland. In the small settlement, tucked against the jagged, snow-capped peaks, there was a quiet expectation that winter would come hard and fast this year. Jacob Winterbourne, a solitary man by nature, had long known what the others would come to learn. This land did not forgive. But the others had no way of understanding, for they were soft, accustomed to the comforts of warmer days. He had already begun to dig the trench. While others were preparing their cabins and stores for the coming season, Jacob was alone, moving the earth with a shovel in the early hours of the morning. His neighbors would shake their heads and whisper behind his back, calling him mad. But Jacob knew that no one understood what he was doing. Not yet. As he worked, his mind raced back to the earlier years, to the time when he had first come to this wild land. He had been naive then, thinking that shelter and supplies were enough. But he had learned quickly. A cabin, even a well-built one, would never be enough. It was the cold that would find its way inside, creeping through the walls like a thief in the night. It was the snow and the water that would find their way through the weakest points of any structure, and if one didn't stay ahead of it, the consequences could be dire. That winter had nearly killed him, and he had sworn it would never happen again. Jacob dug the trench with slow, deliberate strokes. It was a back-breaking task, but he didn't mind the labor. His muscles burned with each movement, and yet there was something calming about the rhythm. There was a purpose to it, a certainty that he was doing something no one else could yet understand. The neighbors didn't see it that way, though. They watched from their windows as Jacob spent hours every day, moving the snow, shaping the trench, creating a boundary around his Quonset hut. "He's lost his mind," they would say. "He's just digging a hole in the snow for no reason at all." But Jacob wasn't digging just to pass the time. The trench was his answer, his shield, his protection from the elements, a barrier that would keep his cabin safe when the world outside tried to swallow it whole. It was hard to explain to people who didn't know. They would see the trench as nothing but a waste of time, a pointless venture in a world that thrived on simplicity. But Jacob had a different perspective. He had seen the destruction that the cold could bring when it seeped inside, unnoticed until it was too late. He couldn't afford to let that happen again. His floor had to stay dry, his firewood had to stay dry, and most of all, his spirit had to remain strong. He wasn't just building a trench, he was fortifying his will to survive. The others laughed. They called him a fool. But Jacob Winterbourne, with his stubborn conviction and his unyielding work ethic, would prove them wrong. Soon they would all see just how valuable his trench really was. By late November, the snow had thickened, and the wind had turned into a savage force that howled through the pass, tearing at the landscape with the fury of an untamed beast. The ground was covered in a blanket of snow, and the mountains had taken on an almost impenetrable silence, save for the occasional creak of trees bending under the weight of the storm. Jacob stood at the threshold of his Quonset hut, his breath clouding the frigid air. His trench, now frozen solid, was already beginning to show signs of its worth. He had taken great care to ensure the drainage worked properly, the trench directing runoff away from the walls of his cabin, but he knew this storm would be a true test of his efforts. He had spent months preparing, building, digging, reinforcing, planning for the worst, and hoping for the best. His neighbors, who once mocked him, had already begun to notice the difference in the way Jacob was preparing. There was something about the way his cabin stood firm against the landscape, a quiet confidence in its structure that made others uneasy. They hadn't thought to prepare in the same way, assuming the harshest of winters could be weathered as they always had before. But as the storm began and the wind screamed across the land, they quickly realized that they had underestimated the severity of what was to come. The first heavy gusts struck around midnight, the winds howling so violently that Jacob could feel the walls of his cabin tremble under the force. The snow piled up in drifts that seemed to appear out of nowhere, blocking paths and forcing the sky to merge with the ground in a blinding white blur. Inside his Quonset hut, Jacob settled into a familiar routine. The fire in the stove crackled, sending warmth into the space, and he closed the door against the tempest outside. For the first time, Jacob took a deep breath, knowing that his hard work was about to pay off. The trench had already proven itself. The floor was dry, and the cold had not yet found its way inside. The small creek that ran near his cabin had turned into a raging torrent, but the trench had diverted the water just as he had planned. The snow piled high around the edges, but the earth beneath his cabin remained solid, unaffected by the flood of snowmelt that would have destroyed a lesser shelter. Jacob had no way of knowing what the storm would bring in the days to come, but he was ready. As the wind howled outside, he sat back, feeling the heat of the fire on his face, watching the storm rage through the window. He had no illusions about the difficulties ahead, but as the storm intensified, Jacob Winterbourne knew he had made the right choice. Tomorrow, his neighbors would begin to see it too. They would understand what the trench had done. His shelter was standing firm, unshaken by the wrath of the storm. In the face of nature's fury, Jacob's ingenuity had won, for now, and as the snow continued to fall, Jacob Winterbourne knew that the trench around his Quonset hut had made all the difference. The storm raged through the night, its fury unabated as the wind howled through the trees and the snow drifted higher, inching toward the windowsills of Jacob's Quonset hut. Inside, he had long since settled into a rhythm of solitude, his only company the crackling of the fire and the sound of his own thoughts. But as the wind screamed outside, something else stirred in Jacob, a deep, unsettling feeling. Though the warmth of the fire kept the cold at bay inside his cabin, there was something about the silence that accompanied the storm that felt like an ominous presence. The wind was relentless, and it had already begun to build up against the cabin's walls. But outside, his trench held strong. The snow was being diverted away from the cabin's foundation, and the runoff was flowing into the creek at a steady pace. The trench, dug deep into the earth, was doing exactly what he had hoped, and yet Jacob couldn't shake the sense of being watched. By morning, the storm had shown no sign of letting up. Jacob donned his heavy coat and gloves, slipping into his boots before heading out to inspect the trench. The wind had not died down, and the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes. The world outside looked like a painting, a landscape of white and gray, where everything was muted except for the roar of the wind. Jacob paused just outside the door, taking a moment to survey the scene. His trench was now covered in a thick layer of snow, but it still served its purpose. The creek, swollen with the weight of melting snow, rushed beneath the ice like a river of white, diverted safely by his careful construction. The trench had done its job, and Jacob's shelter was as dry and warm as it had been the day before. But it wasn't just the trench that held Jacob's attention. Through the driving snow, he could see the outlines of the other cabins in the distance. And there, standing alone in the clearing near the farthest cabin, was a figure. The figure was barely visible through the swirling snow, but there was no mistaking it. One of the neighbors, who had mocked him months ago for digging the trench, was standing there, staring toward Jacob's hut. Jacob couldn't help but watch. The figure didn't move. It stood stock still, as though waiting for something, for some signal that the storm would break, or that the ground would shake free of its frozen grip. but the figure did nothing. The wind howled louder, snapping Jacob out of his trance. He turned back toward the door, his hand on the handle. He had no reason to concern himself with the others. The storm was theirs to weather, just as it was his. Still, something lingered in Jacob's mind as he entered the warmth of his cabin, the sight of that figure remaining etched in his thoughts. Days passed, and the storm continued its relentless assault on the land. The snow fell in sheets, accumulating deeper and deeper, until it felt as though the entire world had been swallowed up by the white expanse. The temperature dropped to bitter extremes, and the wind seemed to bite right through to the bone. Yet inside Jacob's Quonset hut, the fire burned brightly, casting flickering shadows against the walls. The trench had proved itself to be more than just a simple diversion of water. It was his lifeline. His floor remained bone dry, his firewood protected from the damp, and the water that ran in the creek was channeled safely into the earth. The cabin stood firm and strong against the elements, and yet, despite his victory, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only the beginning of something larger. As the days wore on, he began to notice small things, the kind of things that others might overlook in the madness of survival. The trapper's cabin nearest to his had been silent for days, a fact that only grew more apparent with each passing hour. Normally, Jacob would hear the sounds of movement, the creak of wood, the sounds of someone preparing food or stoking a fire, but now there was nothing. Jacob's mind returned to that figure he had seen standing by the far cabin. The person had not moved, not even when the wind howled louder and the snow began to bury everything. Jacob knew that the storm had been unrelenting, and he wondered whether the others had been prepared for it. He had spent months making sure his own cabin was ready, but he could not help but feel responsible for the others. They had laughed at his trench, thinking it unnecessary. He had proved them wrong, but in the end, would that be enough? He couldn't wait any longer. Jacob grabbed his coat and stepped into the cold once more. The wind hit him like a slap, and the snow swirled around him in great biting clouds. But he pressed on, trudging through the deep drifts that had already formed around his cabin. It didn't take long to reach the neighbor's cabin. As he approached, he saw the unmistakable signs that someone had been trying to clear the snow from the door. But it was half-hearted, a sign of weariness. The door was barely open, and Jacob could see the outline of something inside, something that didn't look right. He pushed the door open, the weight of the snow forcing it to creak in protest. Inside it was eerily quiet. The fire had long since gone out, and the chill in the air was palpable. Jacob moved deeper into the cabin, his breath quickening as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. And then he saw it. The neighbor, the one who had mocked him all those months ago, lay slumped against the wall, barely alive. His face was pale, his body trembling with cold. He had been caught unprepared, his cabin too poorly constructed to withstand the storm. The trench Jacob had built had saved him, but it had not saved his neighbor. Jacob knew what he had to do. He gathered the man in his arms and dragged him back through the snow to his own cabin. Every step was a struggle, every movement a battle against the unrelenting cold. But Jacob didn't stop. He could not. The storm outside seemed endless, but in that moment, Jacob knew that survival wasn't just about clever construction. It was about helping each other when the world tried to break them down. Jacob's cabin was warmer now, the fire crackling as the two men sat close to it. The stranger, once a neighbor who had laughed at Jacob's trench, was now nestled under blankets, still shivering despite the warmth of the hearth. Jacob couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Relief that he had saved the man, but a growing anger simmering beneath the surface. The storm had revealed the harsh reality that some were better prepared than others, and yet not everyone had the foresight to understand the danger before it was too late. The neighbor's name was Thomas Hayes. He had been a trapper like Jacob, but where Jacob had built his shelter with foresight and caution, Thomas had thought his own cabin would stand firm against anything. He had believed that the typical construction techniques, fast, simple, and cost-efficient, would suffice for the harsh winters. Now, as Jacob looked down at him, pale and weakened from the cold, it was clear that those assumptions had been gravely wrong. "Never thought a trench would make the difference," Thomas muttered weakly, his voice hoarse from days of exposure and frostbite. He had been caught in the storm, his cabin's foundation failing under the weight of the snow and ice. "Thought I could tough it out like always." Jacob didn't say anything in response at first. There was no need to. He had already seen enough, seen the broken structures in the distance, the damage done by the storm to those who had mocked his preparations. Thomas's situation was just one more testament to the fragility of the life they lived out here. But despite the anger he felt, Jacob's sense of compassion won out. They were all in this together now, whether Thomas had recognized it before or not. "You'll need to stay here until you're strong enough," Jacob said, his voice steady but kind. He added more wood to the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle in the hearth. The warmth was a small comfort in the midst of the storm, and Jacob knew that once the storm passed, Thomas would need to find his own way. But for now, survival was the only thing that mattered. The days passed, and Thomas's condition slowly improved, though he still clung to the edge of life. The storm outside showed no signs of easing, the snow continuing to fall in heavy, suffocating blankets. Jacob spent hours checking the trench, ensuring it still diverted the melting snow away from his cabin. But he also spent time watching over Thomas, bringing him food and keeping him as comfortable as possible. The man had been foolish, yes, but Jacob would not let him die. Inside the cabin, the heat from the fire kept the cold at bay, but the wind howled through the cracks in the wall, a reminder that nature could strike at any moment. Even with the trench and his meticulous preparation, Jacob knew that survival was never a guarantee. He had learned that lesson the hard way in years past. One morning, as the storm's intensity began to wane, Jacob finally spoke to Thomas about the trench again. "You see now," Jacob said, his voice low and measured, "what I did wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who lives out here. The weather can break you down, but if you don't take precautions, it will do worse than that." Thomas nodded weakly, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. "I understand now, but I was too late." Jacob didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned back to the window, staring out into the snowstorm. The cold had become a constant companion, and while the storm might have passed, he knew another one could be just around the corner. They would always come, one after another, relentless, unyielding. And for those who couldn't see the storm coming, the cost could be devastating. The storm had begun to ease, though the snow still fell in sheets, coating the ground with a thick, almost suffocating blanket. Jacob looked out from his cabin's small window, watching the wind whip the snow across the land. For days, the world had been locked in a white, blinding haze. Now the storm was finally weakening, but the consequences of its fury were becoming clearer. Jacob stood and turned toward Thomas, who had grown stronger with each passing day. He was still weak, but the worst of the frostbite had been treated, and he was beginning to sit up, his voice less strained. Jacob had taught him some of the survival basics, how to care for injuries, how to fortify a shelter, and most importantly, how to see the warning signs of nature's wrath before it took hold. But even as Thomas recovered, Jacob knew that the worst was far from over. The storm had claimed many lives, but the real test was what would come next. The snow would melt in the coming weeks, and the risk of flooding would rise. The trench Jacob had built had done its job in protecting his cabin, but what about the others? Would they be ready for what came after the storm? Jacob spent the morning walking outside, checking the trench, and ensuring the runoff was still flowing in the right direction. The snow was thick around the edges, but the water that ran through the trench remained clear, diverted from the foundation of his cabin. It was holding up, just as he had planned. But it was more than just the trench that mattered now. It was the people who would survive and those who wouldn't. Thomas had been given a second chance, but Jacob couldn't help but wonder how many others were still out there, unprepared, unready for what the world would throw at them. He turned back to his cabin, where the warmth of the fire beckoned him inside. Thomas was sitting near the hearth now, rubbing his hands together in an attempt to warm them. Jacob knew that, like him, the man had been forced to confront the reality of survival in the wilderness. It wasn't about strength or courage alone. It was about foresight, planning, and preparation. The trench had saved them, but it had also taught them a crucial lesson. Survival wasn't guaranteed. Jacob stepped inside and closed the door behind him, sealing out the cold. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us, Thomas. The storm might be over, but the real challenge is still coming." Thomas nodded, his face showing the wear of the past days. "I'm ready," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'll help however I can." Jacob looked at him for a long moment, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Good, because out here we either work together or we don't survive at all." With that, Jacob knew their next challenge had already begun. The trench had been just the beginning. The real test would come when the waters rose and the land began to shift beneath their feet. The days following the storm's retreat brought a quiet stillness to the land. The snow that had once buried everything now began to melt, dripping from the branches of trees and collecting in rivulets on the ground. The world outside Jacob's cabin had shifted from a blinding white to a muddled mix of slush and ice. Jacob stood outside, watching the transformation unfold. The trench, which had been vital during the storm, now became an even more critical part of his survival. The melting snow had started to overflow, pushing against the earth that had once held it back. Jacob had been prepared for this. He had expected the runoff to become an issue once the temperatures rose. But seeing it in action was still a sobering reminder of how fragile the land could be, how quickly it could change. The trench had proven itself, but now Jacob had to make sure it didn't fail. He worked tirelessly over the next few days, shoring up the edges, reinforcing the boundaries, and directing the water where it could do no harm. He didn't have much time. Once the thaw was in full swing, the risk of flooding would grow exponentially. As Jacob worked, he could hear Thomas inside, still recovering from his brush with death. He was trying to help when he could, but the man was still weak, his body not fully recovered from the effects of the storm. Jacob understood. After all, Thomas had barely survived. But now was not the time for rest. The thaw was relentless, and it had to be managed carefully. Jacob spent the early morning hours digging further into the ground, widening the trench as much as he could, carefully carving out space for the melting snow to run off. He created small channels that directed the water away from the cabin's foundation. With every shovel full of earth, the trench grew deeper, its path more defined. He knew that every inch he worked on would buy him valuable time later, when the snow really began to melt and the ground became saturated. The labor was grueling, but Jacob didn't mind. He had spent his life working with the land, and he knew its rhythms better than anyone else in the area. The work was familiar, comforting even, because it gave him control over the one thing that could undo everything, the elements. After hours of labor, Jacob finally stood back to survey his progress. The trench was holding steady, its path clear and deep. The earth surrounding it had been reinforced, and it now stretched farther than he had originally planned. As he surveyed the work, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The trench was ready for the flood that was sure to come. Behind him, Thomas emerged from the cabin, moving slowly but steadily. He still wore the exhaustion from his illness on his face, but there was determination in his eyes. "Looks like you've been busy," Thomas called out, his voice rough but stronger than it had been. Jacob nodded. "We'll need to keep at it. The thaw's just getting started, and the worst is yet to come." Thomas walked over, his boots sinking slightly in the mud. He glanced down at the trench, his eyes widening in realization. "You were right," he muttered. "I didn't understand what you were doing at first, but now I see it." Jacob didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He had known all along that the trench wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about surviving what came after. But watching Thomas finally understand the necessity of it was satisfying in its own way. The thaw had begun, and the runoff was already starting to fill the trench. Jacob could feel the tension in the air, the quiet anticipation of nature's slow fury. The land was soft now, and the earth felt like it was shifting beneath his feet. There was no going back. The true test was coming. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the thaw had taken hold of the land with a ferocity that left little doubt in Jacob's mind. This would be no ordinary spring melt. The snow had turned to slush, the ground soft and muddy, and the creek near his cabin had swelled to twice its usual size, rushing with the water from the melting snow and ice. Jacob stood on the edge of the trench, watching as the runoff flowed in steady streams toward it. He had prepared for this, but even now, standing before the rising waters, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. The trench was holding firm, its walls reinforced and deep, but the volume of water that had accumulated over the past few days was overwhelming. The creek had spilled its banks, flooding the nearby forest, and the ground around his cabin had become a soupy mess of water and mud. "This is just the beginning," Jacob muttered to himself, eyes scanning the land, watching as water pooled in every low point. He knew that the true test of his work was coming. Once the runoff from the mountain streams combined with the thawed snow, the water would have nowhere to go but up. Inside the cabin, he could hear the faint sounds of Thomas moving around. He had become more active over the past few days, but he still wasn't well enough to do much. Jacob had put him to work gathering firewood, but beyond that, the physical demands of survival were still too much for the sick man. Jacob's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a loud crash outside. He turned quickly, his heart racing as he ran toward the door. It wasn't the water that had caused the noise, but a large section of the snowbank along the edge of the trench had collapsed. The weight of the water had softened the earth around the trench's edge, and now a large chunk of snow and ice had fallen into the path, threatening to block the flow of runoff. Without thinking, Jacob grabbed his shovel and rushed out into the muck. The ground was slick beneath his boots, and his muscles screamed as he dug into the saturated earth. Water splashed up around him, soaking his clothes as he worked furiously to clear the snow. He couldn't afford for the trench to become clogged. If it did, the water would pour straight into the cabin's foundation, undoing all of his hard work. His breath came in short gasps, and sweat dripped down his brow despite the chill in the air. Every movement felt like a battle against time. The trench had to stay open. He had made the right choice. But if the trench failed now, all would be lost. Minutes felt like hours as Jacob cleared the path, the snow and ice slowly giving way to his efforts. When the final chunk of snow was removed, he stood back, his hands shaking from the effort. The water rushed through the trench once more, its flow unimpeded. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and let out a slow breath. The waters were still rising, but for now, he had won. The trench was holding, but Jacob knew that the real test was still ahead. The next days would be the true trial of his work, and with each passing hour, the rising waters only made it clearer that the storm was far from over. By late afternoon, the water was no longer just rising, it was rushing. Jacob could hear it in the distance, the powerful, relentless sound of the creek breaking its banks and pushing its way through the landscape. The trench had been designed to handle a heavy flow, but even he knew there was a limit to what it could bear. Standing at the edge of his cabin, Jacob surveyed the scene, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the distant rise of water. The trench was holding, its path clear and deep, but the runoff was swelling at a dangerous rate. The mountains above, laden with the snow of the past winter, were melting faster than anyone could have predicted, and the spring thaw was coming all at once, bringing an overwhelming amount of water. Jacob's stomach tightened. He knew the land, had worked it for years, but this was different. The water was relentless, and the earth, still saturated from the previous storms, was beginning to give way under the pressure. His trench, no matter how carefully built, was under siege. The constant pressure of the water was beginning to erode the edges, slowly at first, then more quickly as the flow increased. "Thomas," Jacob called, turning to his cabin. Thomas had been sitting inside for most of the day, still recovering, but he had grown stronger with each passing hour. Jacob needed him now. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face pale but determined. "What's going on?" he asked, noticing the urgency in Jacob's voice. "The trench is holding, but it's close. We need to reinforce the edges before the floodwaters get any higher," Jacob replied, already grabbing his tools. "The runoff is picking up speed. If it breaches the trench, the cabin could flood, and everything we've worked for will be undone." Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Despite his weakened state, he was already moving toward the door. "I'll help however I can," he said. Jacob didn't hesitate. The two men worked quickly, reinforcing the trench with whatever they could find: branches, logs, even large stones from the creek. They worked together, creating barriers along the trench's path, hoping to prevent the water from spilling over the edges. Hours passed in a blur, with each minute feeling like an eternity. The water crept higher, swirling around their makeshift reinforcements, testing every inch of their work. Jacob could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him as he struggled to hold back nature's fury. He had worked so hard to prepare for this moment, but the land was relentless, and he knew it wouldn't stop until it had taken what it wanted. As night fell, Jacob stood at the edge of the trench, watching the water swirl around the rocks and logs they had placed. The trench was holding, but barely. The land felt like it was shifting beneath him, like it was on the edge of something terrible. He wasn't sure how much longer the trench would stand up to the pressure. All he could do was wait, and hope that it would be enough. The night brought no relief. If anything, the storm's aftermath had only intensified, the weight of the rising floodwater pressing against the trench with an almost sinister urgency. Jacob woke to the sound of water running over the earth, more forceful now and heavier than before. It wasn't just the creek that was swelling. The entire land seemed to be shifting under the strain. He rose quickly, moving through the darkened cabin, his boots hitting the cold floor with purpose. There was no time to waste. He grabbed his coat and moved toward the door, only to stop when he saw the darkness outside. The storm clouds had cleared, leaving behind a muted sky, but the earth below was a different story. Saturated, soft, and unrelenting. The flood was now a full-scale assault on his home, on his life's work. Jacob didn't wait for Thomas to catch up. He moved with speed and determination, knowing that the trenches might be the only thing standing between the cabin and the rising tide. As he reached the edge of the trench, he could see the problem. The floodwaters had begun to seep into the areas they hadn't reinforced. The edges, where the soil had softened and loosened, his makeshift barriers had held, but not without a cost. The water had found new ways to slip through the cracks. "Thomas!" Jacob shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night. Thomas appeared beside him moments later, breathless and shivering, his face pale but his eyes sharp. "We need to move faster," Jacob said. "The water's too high. We need more barriers, stronger ones. The trench won't hold much longer." Without waiting for a response, Jacob grabbed a nearby piece of wood and began shoring up the weakest points in the trench. He felt the cold, numbing pain of the floodwater as it splashed over his boots, but he ignored it. His focus was singular now, stopping the flood from overwhelming everything. Thomas worked alongside him, though he was clearly struggling. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his movements were slower than usual. But he didn't complain. He understood the stakes. Together they built up the trench, reinforcing it with whatever they could find. Heavy branches, large rocks, pieces of wood. They worked tirelessly, the hours passing without much notice, the cold creeping deeper into their bones. Jacob could see the water encroaching on them, inch by inch, the pressure mounting with each passing moment. And then it happened. With a deafening crash, a section of the trench wall caved in, and water poured over the edge, flooding into the cabin's foundation. Jacob cursed, running toward the breach, but the water was too much. He scrambled, trying to plug the gap, but it was hopeless. The flood had broken through, and there was no stopping it now. Jacob stood frozen for a moment, watching as the water surged around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the cabin was no longer safe. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was now at the mercy of the flood. "Get inside," Jacob shouted to Thomas, who was still trying to help him block the breach. "It's too late for this. We need to save what we can." Thomas nodded, retreating toward the Caspian as Jacob followed closely behind. They had done everything they could, but the flood was now in control, and survival was all that mattered. The water swelled, rising fast, and Jacob could feel the cold creeping up his legs as he stepped back into the cabin. They had fought long and hard, but nature had finally won this round. Now all Jacob could do was wait and hope that the storm would pass, and that the flood would eventually subside. The water inside the cabin crept higher, its cold fingers curling around the floorboards, pushing upward with an eerie persistence. The once dry space now felt like a trap, a precarious shell of safety against the rising tide. Jacob could hear the creaking of the walls, the subtle groan of the structure shifting under the pressure. He felt the weight of the moment, the feeling of helplessness creeping into his chest as he stared at the flooding floor. "Keep moving," Jacob urged, his voice strained but urgent. He grabbed a few essential items from the shelves, blankets, tools, anything that might be salvaged. Thomas, still struggling to keep up, was already drenched, his face drawn with exhaustion, but he nodded and began to gather what little they could carry. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a refuge in name only. The floodwaters were relentless, creeping up faster than Jacob had expected. Each wave that came through the door threatened to overwhelm them entirely. The trench they had worked so hard to reinforce had failed, and now the consequences of their limited preparations were clear. Jacob had built the trench with the belief that it would be enough, but nature had proven otherwise. He moved toward the back of the cabin, where the storage space was slightly elevated. It was the only part of the cabin that remained dry, though even that was beginning to show signs of water seepage. He grabbed the tools he had used to fortify the trench and began improvising, hoping for a miracle. Thomas staggered over, his legs shaking from the cold. "Jacob, what are we going to do? The water's coming up too fast." Jacob paused for a moment, looking out through the small window. He could see the swollen creek, now a wide river, surging across the land with an almost terrifying speed. The storm had broken the dam of snow and ice, and the thaw had triggered a flood that no trench, no matter how well built, could withstand. "We're not done yet," Jacob said, though the doubt in his voice was clear. He wasn't sure what else he could do, but he knew there had to be a way out. "We need to get higher ground, get out of the cabin before it's completely submerged. We've got to move fast." Thomas nodded weakly. He didn't need to be told twice. The cabin was now a sinking ship, and they were its only passengers. With quick movements, Jacob secured the few remaining supplies, anything they could carry or salvage, and ushered Thomas toward the door. The water was now knee-deep, and the current inside the cabin had started to swirl, making each step treacherous. But the moment they stepped outside, the full extent of the flood became even clearer. The landscape had transformed into an unrecognizable expanse of mud, water, and debris. The trench was gone. It had been swallowed by the rising tide. They had to move quickly, or they would be swallowed by it too. "Up the hill," Jacob shouted, pointing toward the rise in the land above their cabin. "We'll make it to the ridge. It's our only shot." Thomas, despite his exhaustion, nodded and began to stumble in the direction Jacob pointed. The rising water was no longer just a concern. It was a force they had to outrun. The snowmelt, the overflowing creek, the runoff, it was all coming together, pushing them toward the ridge. The higher ground was their only chance to escape the flood. Jacob didn't look back as they climbed. He could hear the sound of rushing water behind them, the current of the flood pushing everything it touched in one swift, brutal motion. As they climbed, Jacob found himself praying for something, anything, to hold the water back. But the land had already spoken. They couldn't outrun nature, but for now, they could stay ahead of it. The climb up the hill was grueling, made worse by the deepening water and the thick, sucking mud that clung to their boots. Jacob's muscles ached from the exertion, but he didn't dare slow down. His mind was focused entirely on the ridge ahead, the only hope left in a land that was drowning. Thomas stumbled behind him, his breathing ragged and shallow, but Jacob could hear his footsteps growing more determined with each step. As they neared the top, the land began to flatten out, the incline less steep, and Jacob allowed himself a small moment of relief. But only a moment. They were still in danger, still at the mercy of the floodwaters. The creek had overtaken the lower ground, and the flood had spread wide. Now they had made it to a small rise, but the danger wasn't over. The land around them was still shifting, still moving. Jacob turned back to look, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of where the water was coming from. The flood was reaching its peak, and the worst of it was still on its way. The land was saturated, soaked with the heavy weight of the melted snow, the earth no longer able to hold the water in place. It was only a matter of time before the ridge would be tested. "Jacob," Thomas said weakly, his voice breaking through Jacob's thoughts, "what if this doesn't stop? What if it keeps coming?" Jacob's gaze hardened, his thoughts clear. It will stop. The thaw will finish, and the snow will be gone, but the land won't be the same. We've got to stay here for now, but once the water recedes, we rebuild." Thomas nodded silently, but the exhaustion was etched on his face. There was a moment of understanding between them, a moment of acknowledgement that survival was no longer about conquering the land, but about finding ways to live with it. The flood had shown them the fragility of life in the wilderness, but it had also given them something else, the chance to start over, to rebuild in a way that might give them a fighting chance. As the last of the floodwaters surged behind them, Jacob turned his eyes to the ridge, his face set in grim determination. They had survived the worst of it, but now came the hard part, rebuilding, starting from nothing. For now, though, the silence of the ridge, the peace of higher ground, was a welcome reprieve from the chaos below. They had made it, against all odds, and in that small victory, Jacob felt the weight of everything he had lost and everything he had yet to regain. The storm had taken its toll, but Jacob Winterbourne had never been one to let nature have the final word. The floodwaters had receded, but the land left behind was unrecognizable. What had once been solid ground, reliable and firm beneath their feet, was now a swampy, treacherous stretch of muck and debris. The creek, which had surged with violent force, had returned to its banks, but the damage it left behind was far-reaching. Large swaths of the lower landscape were flooded, and the familiar sight of the forest had been replaced with the twisted remains of uprooted trees and the remains of structures, broken, ruined, and discarded. Jacob and Thomas stood on the ridge, looking down at the devastation below. The sun had come out after days of relentless rain, casting pale rays over the battered world. It was a brief respite, a quiet moment in the aftermath of chaos, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. The cabin was gone. Jacob had known it was coming, had prepared as best as he could, but the flood had been too much. Even the trench, the one thing he had believed would protect them, had been overwhelmed. Now all that remained was the remains of his efforts, the shattered earth, the muddy, desolate plain, and the knowledge that their home had been taken by the very forces they had tried so hard to manage. "We can't go back there," Thomas said softly, breaking the silence. His voice was weary, tired from everything that had happened. The flood had left him physically drained, but it had also taken a toll on him mentally. The harsh reality of survival had shifted him, made him understand the land in ways he never had before. Jacob didn't respond immediately. He stared at the horizon, his thoughts lost in the vast emptiness of the floodplain. He had spent years building a life here, a life he was proud of, but now it felt as though the land had taken it all away in a single breath. What was left? "I know," Jacob finally said. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of sadness that lingered in his words. "We need to rebuild, start over." Thomas looked at him, brow furrowed. "But where? What can we do now? The land's been torn apart." Jacob took a long breath and turned away from the floodplain. His eyes scanned the ridge, his thoughts turning inward. "There are places. Higher ground. We rebuild, but we rebuild smart." Thomas didn't argue. He had seen enough to know that Jacob's ideas were often the ones that worked. The land had humbled him, just as it had humbled everyone who lived in these wild, unforgiving mountains. But there was something in Jacob's tone, a quiet conviction, that made Thomas believe that they could recover from this, that they could start again. "We've got what we need to survive," Jacob continued. "We can find food and we can build shelter. Maybe it's not the same, but we make it work." "Yeah, we'll make it work," Thomas repeated, nodding slowly. He was still too weak to do much, but the spark of determination was starting to flicker back in his eyes. "Let's do it then. Start again." As they turned their backs on the devastation below, the sun continued to shine weakly in the sky, casting long shadows over the wreckage of their former life. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since the flood, Jacob allowed himself a small sliver of hope. They weren't finished yet. Not by a long shot. Days passed, and the quiet peace of the ridge began to feel like a fragile veneer. The land, still wet and boggy, was a reminder of how quickly everything could change. The creek had retreated, but the flood had left its mark, carving paths through the terrain, leaving the earth scarred and unsettled. Jacob spent his days surveying the land around them. He knew they couldn't stay on the ridge forever. The water would rise again, the cold would return, and the elements would continue to test them. But there had to be somewhere they could start over, somewhere where they could rebuild, and maybe, just maybe, learn from the mistakes they had made before. Thomas had been getting stronger each day, but he was still weak. He couldn't help much with the heavy labor of rebuilding, and Jacob had to make the decision alone. They needed a new place, a place that offered safety, but also resources, a place where they could hunt, fish, and eventually make a home again. "I've been thinking," Jacob said, breaking the silence one evening as they sat near the fire. Thomas was leaning against a boulder, his eyes distant but listening. "We need to move further up into the mountains." Thomas turned his head slowly. "Up into the mountains?" His voice was filled with disbelief. "But the weather is harsh up there. We'd be exposed." "I know," Jacob said, his voice firm. "But it's the only place left where we can be safe from flooding. It's higher ground, and we can find shelter in the rock faces. I've seen places before when I was traveling. Natural. Caves, spots where water doesn't run. It's the only option." The idea of moving deeper into the mountains, away from the places they had known, was daunting. Jacob understood Thomas's hesitation. It would be a hard journey, the risks would be great, but staying here, on the ridge, wasn't an option. The land was too unstable. The creek was likely to flood again with the next thaw, and this time they might not be so lucky. Thomas was silent for a long while, staring into the fur. Finally he spoke. "You think we'll make it there? That it'll be worth it?" Jacob looked into the fire as well. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, but there was something in his chest, a spark of hope, that wouldn't go out. "We have to. It's the only way. If we stay here, we'll just be waiting for the next flood. We need to find a place where we can have some control over our lives again, some peace." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding. "All right, we'll move into the mountains." The decision had been made. Jacob knew it wouldn't be easy. The mountains were a harsh, unforgiving place, but it was a place of possibility, a place that, for the first time in weeks, felt like it could offer them a new chance. As they prepared to leave the ridge, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the world around them seemed to pause in the stillness of the evening. Jacob took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but it was a road they would travel together, and in that there was hope. The mountains, with all their dangers and challenges, now felt like the promise of a future. It was time to move forward. The morning sun rose over the mountains, casting long shadows on the rugged terrain as Jacob and Thomas gathered their belongings. The journey ahead would be difficult, a test of both their physical endurance and their mental resolve. They had little more than the clothes on their backs, a few tools, and the bare necessities to survive. Yet as they packed, there was an undeniable sense of determination in the air. The land they had once known had betrayed them, but the mountains ahead held the promise of something different, a chance to rebuild. Jacob, though exhausted, had never been more certain of his decision. He knew the mountains were harsh, but they also offered a level of security the floodplain could never provide. They would be closer to the resources they needed: game, fresh water, shelter, and perhaps most importantly, isolation from the dangers of rising floods. The climb was steep, and the weight of their belongings made each step heavier than the last. The terrain was uneven, and the sharp rocks beneath their boots scraped and cut. But Jacob kept moving. Thomas struggled more than he let on, but he kept pace with Jacob, refusing to slow down. The cold air bit at their faces, and the ever-present wind howled through the mountain passes, but neither of them spoke about the difficulty of the journey. There was no room for weakness, not now. By midday, they reached a plateau where the land flattened out slightly. It wasn't much, but it would provide a place to rest. As Jacob set down his pack, he looked around. They were a long way from home now, deeper into the mountains than either of them had been. But for the first time in a long while, Jacob allowed himself to feel the flicker of hope. They were moving forward, not backward. By the time dusk settled over the mountains, Jacob and Thomas had made significant progress. The air had grown colder, but the landscape had also begun to change. Jagged cliffs and dense trees gave way to open stretches of rocky terrain. It was here, among the craggy outcrops, that Jacob had hoped to find what they needed: shelter. "We'll be safe here," Jacob said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. He pointed to a series of large rock formations that stood against the mountain, offering a natural barrier against the wind. The rocks seemed to form a sheltered alcove, perfect for a temporary camp. Thomas nodded, too tired to argue. He knew they couldn't keep going much further, and the shelter provided by the rocks was exactly what they needed. Together they cleared the area of loose stones and gathered what little wood they could find for a fire. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and the wind began to howl through the crags, but the shelter they had found offered some protection from the elements. As Jacob set up the fire, Thomas wrapped himself in the thin blanket he had been carrying. The warmth of the flames was a relief after the cold, and for a brief moment they allowed themselves to sit in silence, simply grateful for the respite. "We'll stay here for tonight," Jacob said, staring into the fire. "In the morning, we'll keep moving. But for now, this is enough." Thomas didn't speak, but he nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. They had made it this far, and that was enough for tonight. The morning arrived too quickly, with the cold biting at their faces as the sun barely pierced the mountain peaks. Jacob woke first, his muscles sore from the previous day's climb, but there was no time to linger. The mountains still loomed ahead, and they had a long way to go before they could find a place to settle. Thomas had been asleep in the shelter of rocks, wrapped in his blanket, still fighting the exhaustion that had plagued him since the flood. Jacob knew that he couldn't wait for Thomas to fully recover. They couldn't afford to rest for too long, but he made sure his companion was awake before making any moves. "Come on, Thomas," Jacob said, voice firm but not unkind. "We can't stay here. The higher we go, the safer we'll be." Thomas groggily rubbed his eyes, nodding in agreement, though it was clear the journey was taking its toll on him. The mental and physical exhaustion had started to set in, and Jacob could see it in the way Thomas moved. But there was no choice. They couldn't stay here forever. They had to press on, to find a place that could give them shelter, something permanent. They packed up their meager belongings and started up the mountain again. The ascent was steeper than before, the rocks slippery underfoot, and the thin air making it harder to breathe. But Jacob kept pushing forward, Thomas following as best as he could. They didn't speak much, each focusing on the climb, on the next step that would take them closer to safety. As the day wore on, the higher they climbed, the more the landscape changed. The trees thinned and the rugged rock formations became more pronounced. Jacob's eyes scanned the horizon. He was looking for a sign, a cave, a place that would shield them from the coming winter. By the time the sun set, they had found what they were looking for, a small cave nestled into the side of a cliff. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shelter them from the worst of the cold. Jacob allowed himself a deep breath, knowing that they had finally found a temporary home. The days that followed were a blur of labor and survival. Jacob and Thomas had finally found a place that could offer them some semblance of safety. The cave, though small, was a perfect refuge from the fierce winds and relentless cold of the high mountains. The nights were still bitterly cold, but the shelter kept them safe, and they could focus on building their new life, step by step. The first priority was firewood. Jacob spent hours each day searching the surrounding area, carefully gathering what he could. The forest was sparse, but there were enough fallen branches and small trees that they could cut down to keep a fire going. The warmth from the flames was a relief, especially for Thomas, who was still weak but beginning to regain some strength. As the days turned into weeks, Jacob found a rhythm. He would spend his mornings scouting for more firewood, and, in the afternoons, he would work on reinforcing the cave with rocks and branches to make it sturdier. Thomas, too, began contributing more, gathering herbs and scouting small game. It wasn't easy, and they were still far from comfortable, but the tension that had marked the early days of their journey slowly began to ease. It was during one of their long evenings by the fire that Jacob finally spoke of what had been on his mind for days. "We're going to make it, Thomas. We're not just surviving anymore, we're building something." Thomas nodded, his eyes flickering with the warmth of the fire. "Yeah, we are." Jacob could see the spark of understanding in Thomas's eyes. They had both come a long way from the flood, from the destruction of everything they had known. But this new place, this new life, was their chance to rebuild. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. As they sat in the warmth of the fire, the mountains surrounding them, Jacob felt a deep sense of peace. They had made it this far. They had survived the worst the wilderness could throw at them, and now they were moving forward. For the first time in a long time, Jacob allowed himself to believe that a new beginning was possible. The future wasn't certain, but he knew one thing. They had made it this far together, and that was more than enough. The road ahead would still be difficult, but it was theirs to travel, and together they would face whatever came next.